The sound of porcelain shattering against tile still echoes in my chest. 1 second, I was carrying a plate of food toward the table, careful with my aching hands. And the next, I was kneeling on the kitchen floor, shards and chickens sliding across the tiles while 100 eyes stared. My daughter-in-law's voice had cut through the music like a knife. She told me I didn't belong out there with the guests, that my place was in the kitchen. And when the laughter around the table began again, I realized she had said it loud enough for everyone to hear. I wanted to disappear. My cheeks burned as I picked up the broken pieces with trembling fingers, pretending the sting in my eyes came from the sharp edges. But inside, I was crumbling. This wasn't the first time Kelly had found a way to humiliate me. For 6 long years, since I moved into their home after my husband passed away, I had been swallowing her cold remarks and her little reminders that I was more servant than family. I convinced myself silence was the price of peace, that keeping my head down was the only way to protect my son Mark from conflict. But on that night, during his big celebration, I finally saw the truth. My silence hadn't protected anything. It had only given her more power. She glided through the rooms in her perfect dress, accepting compliments for food I had cooked and a home I had scrubbed clean. The applause was hers, while I crouched on the floor picking up fragments of dignity. I thought about every evening I had spent alone in the kitchen while she entertained his colleagues. Every time I had pressed my hands against my knees to stop them from shaking, as she reminded me I was a burden. My heart pounded as I realized that nothing about this arrangement was temporary anymore. I wasn't a guest in my son's house. I was a ghost. Something shifted in me as I rose from that floor. I brushed crumbs from my dress and forced myself to breathe. The humiliation didn't break me the way she hoped it would. It woke me up. For the first time, I felt anger stronger than my fear of making trouble. I had been quiet too long, and the cost of that quiet was my own worth. That night, I made myself a promise. I would not remain invisible. I would not let her rewrite my role in my son's life. My days of silence were over, and though I didn't know yet how, I knew I would find a way to show the truth. The guests kept laughing. The music played on, but inside me, the world was already changing. What began on that kitchen floor was not an ending. It was the start of something neither Kelly nor anyone else at that table expected. And from that moment forward, my life in their home would never be the same. When my husband passed away, the silence in our little house became unbearable. Every corner held memories of him, and I found myself drifting from room to room like a shadow. Mark, my only son, saw the emptiness in my eyes and insisted I come live with him and his wife Kelly. I told myself it would be temporary, just until I found my footing again. I packed a few boxes and moved into their spacious home, believing I was stepping into a safe place where I could heal and still be useful. At first, it felt almost comforting. I cooked dinners, folded laundry, and helped with the small details of the household. I convinced myself I was making life easier for them, that I was filling the gaps left by their busy schedules. Kelly smiled at me in those early days, but looking back, I realize now those smiles had sharp edges. Slowly, subtly, she began to take credit for my work. Guests would compliment the food or the spotless house, and she would accept the praise with graceful ease while I stood in the background, invisible. Day by day, my role shifted. I wasn't a guest, and I wasn't family anymore. I became the silent pair of hands behind every meal, the unseen figure scrubbing the counters, the one making sure fresh flowers sat in the vase on the dining table. Kelly never raised her voice in front of Mark. Her remarks came in small, private doses: a sigh when I entered the room, a tight smile when I forgot to polish the silver just right, or a reminder that she didn't like her towels folded that way. Alone. Each comment was nothing. Together, over 6 years, they hollowed me out. Mark worked long hours at the law firm, often leaving before dawn and returning long after dark. On weekends, he collapsed into bed with piles of paperwork. He never saw the little humiliations, the way Kelly treated me like staff instead of family. In his eyes, she was a devoted wife who had generously opened her home to his widowed mother. I swallowed every bitter moment, telling myself I was protecting his peace. But silence is not peace. Silence is permission. Each time I bit my tongue, I gave Kelly more room to push me further into the shadows. I convinced myself I could bear it, that this was what good mothers did. They endured, they sacrificed, they kept the family whole, even if it meant breaking inside. Still, there were nights I lay awake in my small room at the back of the house and wondered when I had stopped being seen. My hands ached from chopping vegetables. My knees stiffened from scrubbing floors. And yet the only acknowledgement I received was in the form of more demands. I had become invisible in the house I helped keep alive. Looking back, I see how deeply I wanted to believe my silence had meaning. But the truth was far harsher. It only fueled her cruelty. And though I didn't realize it then, life was about to show me something that would break through that denial and force me to confront just how dangerous silence can be. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when nothing is supposed to change. I had gone into town earlier than usual, carrying my grocery list tucked inside my purse. As I passed the front entrance of a downtown hotel, I saw something that made me freeze in place. A red sports car pulled up, and out stepped Kelly. She wasn't alone. Beside her was Mark's oldest friend, the man who had been best man at their wedding, the one who visited our home almost every week. They laughed together, far too close. And then I saw her lean into him, the kind of touch no married woman should give to anyone but her husband. For a moment, I told myself I was mistaken. Maybe it was a friendly embrace. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But then I saw them kiss, casual, unashamed, as if the world around them didn't exist. My stomach dropped. The grocery list crumpled in my hand as my heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint right there on the sidewalk. That evening, I said nothing. I stirred a pot of soup while Kelly floated through the living room, handing out drinks, brushing her hand against Michael's arm in a way Mark never noticed. They laughed at the game on TV while I stood in the kitchen, holding my breath, carrying a secret that threatened to crush me. In the days that followed, I began to see things I had ignored before. Kelly suddenly had errands in the afternoons, always dressed too finely for something as simple as grocery shopping. Michael started visiting more often when Mark was at the office, offering weak excuses for why he was dropping by. Their phones buzzed with messages they never opened in front of my son. And then, little by little, I noticed money missing from the household account, not large amounts at once, but steady withdrawals that made my chest tighten with dread. I couldn't let this slide. Not when my son's trust was being betrayed by both the woman he loved and the friend he called a brother. But I also knew if I spoke too soon, Kelly would twist the story until I looked like a bitter old woman inventing tales out of jealousy. She was clever, and I had seen how easily Mark believed in her polished smile. So I began keeping a notebook, hidden in the back of my dresser. I wrote down dates, times, small details that most people would overlook. Whenever I had the chance, I snapped discreet photos on my old phone receipts Kelly left in her handbag, the red car parked outside the same hotel, a text notification she forgot to clear. Piece by piece, I started building a picture of betrayal that could not be ignored. I told myself to be patient, that the truth needed more than whispers and suspicions. It needed proof, the kind that could not be denied or explained away. As painful as it was to carry this burden alone, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't confront them yet. Not until I had something undeniable in my hands. And that decision, as heavy as it felt, would lead me down a path I never imagined, straight into the office of someone who made a living uncovering secrets. I knew my notebook and a handful of blurry photos weren't enough. Kelly was too smooth, too clever. If I walked into the living room waving my suspicions, she'd twist the truth until I looked like the bitter, lonely mother-in-law trying to ruin her marriage. I needed something she couldn't explain away. Something undeniable. That realization filled me with both dread and resolve. For the first time in years, I decided to step outside my comfort zone and fight back. A week later, I found myself standing outside a modest office above a bakery downtown. The sign on the door read, "Richard Hale, Private Investigations." My hands shook as I pushed it open, wondering if I was making a fool of myself. But Richard's steady presence eased me. He was a retired police officer, with the kind of calm eyes that made me believe he had seen it all. I laid out my little pile of evidence, the notebook filled with dates and times, a few grainy photos of Kelly near the hotel, a receipt I'd found tucked in her purse. I half expected him to laugh at me. Instead, he studied everything carefully and told me this went deeper than I realized. If I wanted the truth, he said, he could get it for me. The following 2 weeks dragged like years. Every time the phone rang, my heart leapt. I busied myself with cooking and chores, all the while imagining what Richard might be uncovering. I replayed the image of Kelly and Michael at the hotel again and again, the kiss that had burned itself into my memory. At night, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how much of my son's life had been built on lies. When Richard finally called me back to his office, I felt sick to my stomach. He handed me a thick folder, heavier than it looked, and told me to brace myself. Inside were photographs sharper than anything I had captured: Kelly and Michael dining together, entering hotels, exchanging envelopes. Then came the bank records, showing transfers from Mark's accounts into places they didn't belong. My pulse raced, but nothing prepared me for the final blow: documents that revealed Kelly wasn't even Kelly. Her real name was Carla Ramirez, and she was still legally married to a man in Nevada. I felt the room tilt as I held the marriage certificate in my hands. All these years, my son had been living with a woman who wasn't his wife at all, but a con artist. Richard explained it wasn't the first time. Multiple names, multiple husbands, drained accounts, and then vanishing. She and Michael were more than lovers. They were partners in crime. Anger burned through the shock. The same woman who called me useless had built her life on deception. And now, for the first time, I had the proof to stop her. I clutched that folder like a lifeline, knowing it carried the power to protect my son from further harm. Back in my small room that evening, I stared at the folder on my desk. For months, I had saved an envelope with $4,000, planning to give it to Kelly as a gesture of goodwill. But now I understood what a foolish dream that had been. Instead, I reached for a plain envelope and began filling it with Richard's evidence, the clearest photograph of her and Michael, the fraudulent marriage certificate, the bank statements. This envelope wasn't money. It was truth. And soon, it would shatter her perfect facade. As I tucked it away behind my cookbooks, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The next time Kelly tried to bask in admiration, I would be the one standing in the light, holding the truth in my hands. The night of the dinner was carefully chosen. Mark had just earned another promotion at the firm, and Kelly insisted on hosting a celebratory meal at a fancy downtown restaurant. Friends, colleagues, and a handful of family gathered around a long table draped in white linen. The air buzzed with laughter, the clink of wine glasses, and the hum of congratulations. I sat quietly at the end of the table, my hands resting on my lap, the envelope of truth tucked firmly inside my purse. Kelly sparkled that evening. Her laughter rang out louder than anyone's, and she accepted every compliment as if the night were hers alone. Michael sat close to her, his eyes following her with a familiarity no one else seemed to notice. Together, they played their parts: flawlessly devoted wife, loyal friend, and Mark, my sweet son, beamed with pride, utterly blind to the storm about to break. As the dishes were cleared and dessert menus passed around, my heart pounded with the weight of what I carried. For weeks, I had debated the right moment. I had envisioned private confrontations, whispered revelations, but no truth this big, this devastating, needed light. It needed witnesses. Tonight, in front of everyone, Kelly's mask would finally fall. I let her soak in the admiration a little longer. She leaned back, smiling as someone praised the dinner, as if she herself had prepared it. Michael raised his glass toward Mark, his words dripping with false warmth. The scene was almost theatrical, and I realized how long I had played the background character in their performance. Not anymore. My hands didn't shake as I reached for my purse. I slid the envelope onto the table with deliberate calm, the soft thud silencing the chatter around me. Eyes turned toward me, curious. I opened the flap and began laying out the contents one by one: photographs of Kelly and Michael entering hotels, bank records with unexplained withdrawals, and finally, the document that revealed her real name, Carla Ramirez, and the marriage certificate proving she was still legally bound to another man. The room froze. Kelly's face drained of color. Michael tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. Mark stared at the papers, his brow furrowed as confusion gave way to horror. Kelly's composure cracked in an instant. She reached for excuses, her voice rising as she tried to weave explanations out of air. Michael slumped in his chair, avoiding Mark's eyes, the weight of evidence crushing any defense he might have had. And Mark, my son, sat in silence, the betrayal carving deep lines into his face. For years, I had kept my silence, believing it protected him. But in that moment, I saw the truth in his eyes. Silence had only prolonged the damage. Now, with everything out in the open, the healing, however painful, could finally begin. The table dissolved into chaos. Friends whispered, colleagues exchanged stunned looks, and waiters lingered awkwardly at the edges. Kelly's panic turned to fury, her words sharp and desperate, but no one believed her anymore. Michael stood and left without a word, abandoning her in the wreckage. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply sat in stillness, watching the truth settle over the room like heavy dust. For once, I wasn't invisible. For once, my presence carried weight. As the evening unraveled, I touched Mark's hand lightly. His eyes were red, his shoulders heavy with betrayal. But he looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years, trust. And though the night ended in heartbreak, I knew it was also the beginning of something else, freedom. The storm had broken, but in its wake, there was finally space for truth. And as I gathered my things to leave, I knew the hardest part was still ahead, the aftermath. The night of the dinner ended in a silence so heavy, it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Guests slipped out quickly, murmuring excuses, leaving behind half-empty glasses and untouched plates. Mark sat frozen at the table, staring at the scattered documents as if they were written in another language. His world had crumbled in front of everyone, and I could do nothing but place a steady hand on his shoulder. That image, my son, broken and bewildered, has never left me. In the days that followed, the house was unbearably quiet. Mark moved through the rooms like a ghost, caught between grief and rage. Sometimes I'd hear him pacing at 3 a.m. Other times I'd find him sitting at the kitchen table long after midnight, just staring at the floor. I knew he was wrestling not only with betrayal, but also with the shame of having been deceived so thoroughly. Kelly, or Carla as I had come to know her, did not give up easily. Her charm turned to venom. She stormed into the house more than once, hurling accusations, slamming doors, threatening that we would regret humiliating her. But this time, her fury no longer frightened me. Mark had already spoken with a lawyer, and the file from the investigator left no room for her lies. Within weeks, legal papers were filed, her fraudulent marriage was void, her schemes with Michael exposed. And when the police traced the stolen funds to offshore accounts, the last pieces of her facade crumbled. I remember the day we learned she had been arrested out of state while trying to con another widower. For years, she had treated me as if I were invisible. Yet in the end, it was my quiet persistence that pulled her empire of lies apart. That knowledge filled me not with triumph, but with a steady, calming strength. Mark eventually came to me, his eyes red from sleepless nights. He confessed the guilt he carried for letting her treat me like a servant in my own son's house. I could see how heavy it weighed on him, and my heart ached for the boy I had raised, still inside the man before me. I told him the truth I had come to learn myself, that love makes us blind sometimes, and silence can be mistaken for peace when it is really complicity. He squeezed my hand, and in that moment, I felt the bond between us start to mend. For the first time in years, I began investing in myself again. The envelope of money I had once planned to give to Kelly became the seed of my healing. I signed up for an art class at the community center, bought myself a small stack of novels I had long wanted to read, and even redecorated my room with colors that made me smile each morning. Little by little, I was no longer the shadow in someone else's home, I was myself again. Mark, too, began to rebuild. He reconnected with old friends, started cooking again, and even allowed laughter back into his life. A year later, he introduced me to Melissa, a woman with a kind spirit who treated me with respect from the very first moment. Watching them together, I could see how far he had come, how much lighter his steps had become since letting go of the past. When I look back on it now, I see that night at the dinner table not only as an ending, but as a beginning. It was the end of years of silence, of swallowing cruelty in the name of keeping peace. But it was also the beginning of a life lived honestly, where dignity and truth mattered more than appearances. To anyone listening, I want you to remember this silence is not always peace, and age does not take away your worth. Your voice, your truth, can change everything when spoken at the right moment. If my story has touched you, share it. Let me know where you're listening from. And never forget the truth, no matter how quiet, carries weight.